Okay, so I'm excited to introduce Dr. Michael Platt, whose research sits at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and marketing. Originally trained in bioanthropology in our own department, he has published in a wide range of disciplinary venues and made numerous public appearances related to his work on the biological mechanisms that underlie decision-making. So without further ado, let me hand it over.
Wow, great, thank you. So thanks for the introduction and the invitation. It's a thrill to be back here in the museum and on the third floor. I've actually never given a talk here. So back in the day when I got my PhD here, there was no requirement for an oral defense, and so I did not avail myself of the opportunity, let's say. So I managed to squeak out of here without speaking to anyone. Much to my own detriment, because I think it would have been very healthy for me to do that. So it's great to be here. I work on a lot of things, and I had a lot of difficulty deciding what to present today. So what I'm going to talk about today will stretch back a bit over my career, but will mostly focus on some relatively recent work using brain imaging to try to understand how people think and feel about brands and how that relates to the way we think and feel about other people. So it's sort of testing an idea that's been in vogue and in practice in marketing and in industry for a couple of decades, but it's sort of first direct evidence. And I hope to be able to spend a little time with the students at the end of this. So I have a hard stop at 2, but it's a conference call, so I can take it from here. And so I'd love to at least have a little bit of an opportunity to talk with you. And if you want to come, if you're interested in what we're doing, I'm happy to meet with students later. We have kind of a big operation, and I always want to make sure that I highlight, I'm basically the chief spokesperson and fundraiser for a team of people who really do all the fantastic work. So there's a bunch of graduate students and postdocs, not all of them. This photo's from 2 years ago. So there's a lot more involved. We have a lot of partners who help to support the work we do, from the federal government, at the NIH, and NSF, but also a number of companies. So we've begun to work directly with corporate partners as a way to identify interesting challenges out there in the real world, challenges that we can hopefully bring answers to, given our expertise and the kinds of resources that we have access to here across all the schools here at Penn, and to put those into practice. And so, and as a result, and we were just talking about this before the introduction, I've experienced everything here at Penn, it feels like, in the last 3 years, and we've actually spun out a neurotechnology company. So we have a startup, which has been taking a lot of demands of my time in the last 6 or 9 months. But it's very exciting. It's also another opportunity I see for people who maybe would like to have a taste for what that's like. If you want to do an internship or do some research with the company, there's a lot of close partnerships between the company and the lab. And the neurotechnology we've developed is a wireless wearable brain monitoring device that's high fidelity and non-obtrusive and can be put into any kind of form factor, from a yoga headband to a safety helmet to a baseball cap. And one of the things that we're really trying to do is neuroanthropology. So it's, we are trying to measure the neurobiology of human experience while people are engaged in, especially what we consider to be kind of ritual activities. Contemporary American ritual activities like being a spectator at a professional sports game, or going through the haunted penitentiary, or rowing on the rowing team, or other kinds of things like that, to try to, one thing I've really been kind of mesmerized by for the last 30 years is this notion of collective effervescence. And so this is something we've really been diving into deeply in the lab, and trying to see what we can derive in practice in terms of complementing our own subjective sense of what our experiences are with something measurable in terms of brain function. So that's a very long preamble. I was a little, I don't know, terrified is an overstatement, but I didn't. The theme for this was pretty complicated. This series, capital, ism, parens, a couple of closed parens, and so I didn't know quite where to fit in on that, but I thought I'll take it at its face and start with capitalism, and kind of dig back to Adam Smith, who's considered the really the father of capitalism, and everybody's aware of the Wealth of Nations, in which he argued that there's this invisible hand that guides the accumulation of wealth and the production of an economy, and it arises from basically individuals pursuing their own self-interest, pursuing those things that are incentivize them and on which they place value, right? And that makes a very concrete assumption, which is that somewhere in our heads we actually have a mechanism for representing or encoding the value of different things, and that value can be compared, right? The values of different things, not just monetary value doing something, but you can compare the monetary value of working for some amount of effort, right? You can compare that with staying home and sleeping. You can compare that with eating a donut, whatever, buying People magazine, so that you have some objective scaling that allows you to make comparisons to pursue those things that maximize your value or utility. And as I was saying, this really assumes that there's somewhere in the brain some kind of representation of value, but that idea there was never any real possibility of testing that idea until really within the last couple of decades. And when I got into neuroscience after I left the PhD program here, so that was in 1994, and I went to NYU to do a postdoc in neuroscience, and people were beginning to talk about decision making, but all the decisions they were talking about were decisions about, is the light red or green? Is the line vertical or horizontal? So not the kinds of decisions that lend themselves very readily to this notion that we're pursuing things. We make decisions based on the value that we place on those things, the estimate of the value. And so I was naive enough to say, well, why don't we actually test this? Well, these aren't really interesting decisions. Why don't we test this idea? And so what we did back and this was a paper published in 1999 that has been considered the first paper in the field of neuroeconomics, was to, we were studying how the brains of rhesus macaques actually make the decision that allows them when they have two options available to them, what allows them to choose one over the other. And in this case, so we had sort of intracranial recording electrodes, so sensors inside the brains of these animals. They can't feel this, just like any human being who's having surgery to implant deep brain stimulating electrodes to treat Parkinson's disease, or an epilepsy patient having electrodes implanted to detect seizure activity. So very same exact kind of setup for monkeys, and we were recording from this part of the brain, posterior parietal cortex, that intervenes between incoming visual signals and an outgoing motor response. And okay, I want to make sure I don't do that again. What I did was to give. Wow, I don't know what changed. Maybe thank you. Yeah, of course. So, all right. So basically what we did was to ask monkeys to make a choice between two options, which were visually identical, and then vary the expected value of the two different options. Monkeys were working for fruit juice, something they really love, and you can, going all the way back to Pascal, you can control the value of the expected value of the two options by varying either the probability that they would pay off with a certain amount of juice, or how much juice would actually be delivered. Okay, so the magnitude of gain, the probability of gain. And what you find is that monkeys are good little economists, so as you raise the relative value of one of the options, they're more and more likely to choose it. Okay, so they're sensitive to the expected value of that option. And if we record from neurons in this part of the brain that is translating or intervening between incoming visual information on the location of the two options and the motor response, we see that their activity also varies more or less linearly with the expected value of the option under consideration, basically suggesting that this decision process here, right, that results in different frequencies of choosing the option, is a result of the activity of these neurons basically scaling from low to high, right? And in fact, if you stimulate these neurons, you can change the monkey's decisions. You can make him more likely to choose one option than another. So this is telling us, I mean, it may not seem shocking to you, but the brain need not be organized this way, that there is an explicit readout of value. So if you were to go stick an electrode and put it into a computer, okay, a computer that's spitting out, I don't know, the running estimates of the S&P 500 or something like that, I guarantee you wouldn't get anything useful out of that. It wouldn't, there would be nothing meaningful, right? So the brain is organized in a different way where we have an explicit signal here of value. And subsequent to that work, work done by a lot of people, including Joe Cable in the psychology department here, show that they're using brain imaging and other technologies in humans, show that there is a network of areas in the brain that encodes explicitly the value of different options that are under consideration, and does so using what we call a common currency, right? So it's value divorced from the modality of what you're actually choosing among. So you can compare the value to you of staying home in bed, right? Getting up and buying People magazine, going and eating a donut, whatever it is, investing in retirement, evaluating the person you might want to marry. All those things scale down to levels of activity in these areas. In fact, what Joe's working on right now is using these signals as a choice-free value decoder, right? In essence, you could put something in front of somebody and you could see how much they actually valued it by reading out these signals, which is a pretty, I think, really interesting, remarkable, if he can actually do it, remarkable thing that has potentially a wide range of applications. Now that all said, right, so now we've talked about pursuing your things that have value to you. Those things, that value is represented in the brain, but I want to turn to a different side of Adam Smith, which is often overlooked, which was kind of earlier in his development of theory, moral sentiments, in which he argued that people aren't only driven kind of by self-interest, but that we are intrinsically sensitive to the needs of others, right? And so we have empathy, and that empathy often motivates our behavior, and that behavior can be at odds with sometimes with our own self-interest. It seems obvious to everybody in this room, but this is a really important part of being a human being, and that's because we're so fundamentally social. So I would argue, we are wired to be social. So we can come together in groups to cooperate, to learn from each other, to do things we couldn't do on our own, right? And this is really responsible for all of the great things that people do, and a lot of the bad things that people do as well, which is that we are we're wired to be social. We're wired to acquire information from other individuals and to use that information to help inform and guide our behavior. And we now know that this kind of wiring to connect has lots of ramifications. So people with stronger connections, deeper, more meaningful connections with other people, actually live longer, healthier, happier lives. They also tend to make a bit more money than other people. So this is, this tells us how important our sort of social brain really is to us. And to kind of just perhaps belabor the point, we know that we're now in the midst of what's been called an epidemic of loneliness, where more than 50% of adults and many more younger adults will endorse the statement that they have felt extremely lonely in the past year. And we know that loneliness is associated with actual physical feelings of pain and illness, and individuals who are lonely, it's like the equivalent of suffering from heart disease or smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So it has a major impact on your health, well-being, and longevity. And to really drive the point home even further, there are some people at the extremes of pathology, right, who have, or neurodiversity, depending on how you want to paint this, who have such profound impairments in spontaneously connecting with other people that it is a huge burden for them. Right? And people with autism, schizophrenia, they have great difficulty integrating into society. This is a huge cost for them and their families, and also for the economy in general. So, there's a sideline of my own research, not a sideline, it's a major thread of my own research, which is trying to understand how this all works and how it goes awry, and if we could develop better understanding and better tools, we might be able to actually improve the lives of these individuals and their families. So that's something that's very important to me. Now, a major discovery over the last decade is that we actually have within our heads a brain network, often called the social brain network or the social brain, that is specialized for managing our connections with others. So it's a suite of brain areas that, especially beginning kind of in the temporal lobe here, initially identifies from your senses who's around you. Are they people? Are they not people? Do I know them? Do I not know them? What are their emotional expressions? What are they paying attention to? Right? And that information then feeds into a couple of other brain areas that are important for, one, empathy. So basically understanding that individual's current experience, right? Emotional experience in particular. And then another area or set of areas that's involved in forming a mental model of that individual's mental state, of their internal state. What do they know? What are they paying attention to? Are they a cooperator? Are they somebody who's a cheater? Do I trust them? And that model then informs the way that you interact with them. So that's sort of how that process works. We know that across individuals, the integrity and health of this brain network, literally the thickness of these brain areas and the thickness of the connections between them, predicts how many friends an individual has. And back in the day, about 10 years ago, it even predicted how many friends you'd have on Facebook. But nowadays, I don't think that's necessarily true, given all the bots and everything else is going on, lack of trust in Facebook. But kind of in the early days, the sort of, when there was a lot of optimism about social media, it did predict how many friends you had. And this is not just destiny, although there's certainly an element to that, because we know from work, experiments done with monkeys by friends of mine at Oxford, showed that monkeys, first of all, have the exact same social brain network. It functions the same way in them as it does in us. And you can do the experiment with monkeys you can't do with people, which is basically you scan these monkeys' brains to ascertain the health and integrity of their social brain network, and then you can put them into different sized groups. So they have to figure out how to get along with different numbers of other monkeys. Okay, develop connections, make connections with them. And what you find 3 months later, you rescan their brains, and there's more or less a linear increase in the connection strengths, okay, across these areas and within these areas as a function of group size. So monkeys who have to figure out how to be friendly, how to make friends and avoid fights with more and more monkeys who just kind of use it or lose it. It's a muscle that you can exercise. Those monkeys will develop a healthier, stronger, better functioning social brain network, right? That I think has lots of implications for a lot of the things that we're interested in. There's certainly a lot of business applications that arise out of this. Now, these two threads of Adam Smith actually kind of come together a bit as well. So there's been a lot of discussion going all the way back to kind of the Tulipmania in Holland back in the 17th century, right, when there's this sort of spectacular bubble form and burst in the tulip bulb market, that this was at least driven in part by social contagion, that you're basically feeling like, oh, if somebody else is going to buy more of these things, and I should buy more of these things because they're going to become more valuable, and I won't be able to afford them if everybody else is buying them. And that has been, we've repeated many times throughout history. So the dot-com bubble as well in 2000 is a good example of that. We now know from experiments in neuroscience that these bubbles, you can play out the same market in the lab while a person is lying in an MRI machine, and you see these bubbles form and burst, and you can predict them based on activity within the social brain network, and that across individuals, people who are less sensitive to others, okay, who just pick up on fewer clues and are less interested in what other people are doing, do better in these markets. So they don't herd, they don't get into bubbles, or they get out of them early, okay, which is, I think, pretty remarkable. Okay, so that's how this just shows that the degree to which we are wired to connect with others drives a lot of other kinds of things at the very level of economic markets. Now, this, I would argue that at kind of the most fundamental, all this behavior begins with perception, and a lot of our behavior as consumers
okay, is strongly influenced, or at least influenced to a certain degree, by the mere presence of other individuals, right? So advertisers discovered this over 100 years ago. You can put an attractive or rugged or high status person next to a product or a brand, and people seemingly be more interested in it and potentially more likely to buy it. Okay? And to me, that suggests that there's something intrinsically valuable about that information, right? And that bleeds over onto the product or brand. And that's something that we tested systematically over a period of about a decade, in which we tried to understand and put a number on the value of social information, and we did so in parallel sets of studies in humans and in monkeys, so that we could kind of look at the macroscopic architecture of the representation, the value of social information in humans, and then get down to kind of the microscopic architecture at the level of individual neurons that are doing all the computing within these networks. Okay, so these are two, this is an image, obviously, of a human being who's young, female, potentially high fecundity. This would be the equivalent in rhesus macaques. So this is a young female who's in good reproductive conditions. We know that male rhesus macaques are very interested, at least behaviorally, when you observe them, in these kinds of displays. Okay, and then if a female is displaying sexual receptivity, they'll follow it around, etc. So it seems like a source of information that would have value for these critters. And so, so what we did was to try to develop, excuse me, a paradigm that would allow us to measure how much individual people and monkeys, how much value they place on seemingly biologically relevant social information. Okay, now you can't ask monkeys questions, so you have to come up with a test that allows you to read that out, okay, from their behavior. And so here's what we did. We called this our monkey pay-per-view task. This was sort of a decade ago. So what we did was it's kind of exactly the same as the paradigm that I talked about earlier. Monkeys are given a choice between two visually identical options. They choose one and then they get a squirt of fruit juice. They choose the other one and they get a squirt of fruit juice, but they see a picture, okay, of another monkey. And then we can vary how much juice the monkeys get for choosing the picture option or the option that does not display a picture, okay? And then we can also vary the sorts of pictures that are on offer for the monkeys, okay? And so what you can do then is to plot the proportion of trials in which the monkey chooses the picture option as a function of its relative payoff, so the monkey should be more likely to choose it as they get more juice in payment for doing so. But if we segregate different curves based on the different classes of social information that are available, if those segregate and slide left and right, this is known as the method of constant stimulation in human psychophysics, then we can read off the point of subjective equivalence where the two options have the same, monkeys are equally interested in both, and the measure in fruit juice units of the value of that social information. So how much do you have to pay the monkey to look at it, or how much will he give up to see it? And I don't mean to imply that the animals are aware of that at all. It's just their behavior. So this red curve is for male monkeys, one male monkey, when he has the option to see female mating displays. Okay, and this curve goes up, but it slides to the left a little bit, meaning that the monkey will give up 10 to 15% in juice to see that set of images. So there's a substitutability there between pictorial information about another individual, right, and juice. Right? And this curve here in green, it slides a little to the right. That's when that male monkey had the opportunity to see sets of pictures of low status males. Okay, so in this case, you have to pay the monkey a little bit extra to view those low status males. Okay? And if you actually look, I know we repeat this many, many times, but if you look across a number of different social categories that are relevant for macaques, hindquarters, that's female mating displays, dominant male subordinates, there's always positive value for seeing the mating displays of females. It's negative value for low status males, and it's also positive value for seeing the faces of dominant males, which might seem a little bit surprising because these are big, scary guys. That doesn't seem like a rewarding thing, right? But this is information, this is valued information. Those are the guys who can drive you away from food, drive you out of territory, etc. They're the ones you have to keep track of. And this actually, these observations validate and go back to work by Chance in the 1960s, suggesting that that status is one of the kind of parameters along which attention is structured within primate societies, and that's everybody kind of searching for the dominant individuals. So we repeated this with humans. I'm not going to make too much about what this might mean in terms of why information is valued, but we were looking for a picture set that would potentially have some interest, some meaning for undergraduates who are going to be the typical participants in a psychology experiment. And at the time we did this experiment, about 10 years ago, all of the image sets that were out there were really boring. They were sort of, everybody looked exactly the same. There was one image set of about 200 German people who all had very dour expressions, and they all looked very similar. And we wanted something that was a little bit more dynamic, so at the time we downloaded thousands of images from this website, hotternout.com, where people could upload images and people would rate them. Very weird kind of thing. There was an algorithm on there that pushed all the ratings kind of toward the middle, so nobody would feel too good or too bad. But it was a way for us to get lots and lots and lots of different kinds of pictures, and then we had independent individuals who were independently rating these images for physical attractiveness. It's always so just rate them on a scale from 1 to 10. And then we just divided that into terciles, and then we could play the same game. In this case, we had male undergraduates at Duke choosing between two options. They were paying off with the sound of coins coming out of a slot machine, which was in direct proportion to how much money got deposited into their bank account. Okay, so it's incentive compatible. So one side gave you money, the other side gave you money and also a picture. Okay, we played the same game, trading off how much money you could get from the two different options. If our participants ignored the pictures, they would take home about, it's about $8 beyond their $10 show-up fee. Okay, but if they were paying attention to the pictures, they could potentially giving up money. And in fact, that's what we find. This is for one male participant. The black curve is for when there's an image set drawn from the part of the distribution that were the highest in rated physical attractiveness. So it slides a little to the left, it slides a little to the right for the lower tercile. Okay, so you could read this off. That's worth about a tenth or something like that. Okay, not a lot, but it's something that's measurable. And when we aggregate across all of the individuals, in this part of the study, we see that a positive value. Okay, basically males will give up, quote unquote. They weren't aware of this, but they will accept less payment to when they have the opportunity to see images of the average to high attractiveness category. Okay, this is for males. For females, we didn't find anything like this. Okay, so which is really remarkable because females, avowedly heterosexual females rated all of the images, and they're rating some of these guys as extremely hot, 9s and 10s, but they were unswayed in terms of their economic behavior. So we did not, and we tested this in two other ways, one of which, in both of these cases, one of which was how long you would wait to get the image, okay, and males would wait like a pretty long time. Females, nope, just give me the money. And how hard would you work? So you had to work hard by alternating pressing of the space bar and the control key to keep the image displayed. And males were like rats banging away for cocaine. And our female participants were just like, let's get on to the next trial. And I can't help but tell the story because it's so fun. It's just kind of revealing. Even during the ratings part of this, the young women who came to rate the images of men, they were just, saying, oh my, they had to do it every 3 seconds, basically, for an hour. They're like, oh my God, this is so boring. When is it going to be over? And our male participants at the end of the hour said, that was really fun. Do you have any more? So there's clearly there's a major difference in sort of the intrinsic value of seeing these images, which could have, I think, lots of origins to that. But the important point for us is that here we now have an objective number, right, based on substitutability that we can look for in the brain, right? So we can translate the value of kind of ineffable social information into something quantifiable that we know how to measure, like dollars and cents or milliliters of fruit juice in the case of monkeys. Okay, when we did the study in our human participants, we found that these same parts of the value network, okay, encoded information not only about monetary value, but also about social value, social information value. Okay, this is just a couple of them. And when we put sensors into those parts of the brain in monkeys, we found that individual neurons like this one encoded information about the value of that social information. So highest activity for the mating displays, a little less for dominant, faces of dominance, a little less for the faces of subordinates, and lowest for a control image. So that's for this part of the brain, and then something very similar for this part of the brain here. So this is basically validating at the level of single neurons that these neurons are computing the value of social information, right? And that can scale and be compared with the value of other kinds of commodities, in this case, whether that's money or juice, what have you. This raises a really interesting question if we think back to that advertising example, right? If social information has intrinsic value for monkeys, as it appears to do for humans, then could you sell products to monkeys by advertising them with the most socially valuable information? Okay, so what we did, we did exactly that. We ran a social advertising campaign for monkeys, and this was done by an undergraduate at Duke, which was a lot of fun. So we would, the monkeys just sat and watched TV, okay, for 3 days. And we would show pictures of this sort of come hither look from a female mating display next to, say, Adidas. And this is a scrambled version of that, the Fourier domain with Nike, or faces of dominant, now Acura. Right? These are brands and logos that mean nothing to the monkeys, okay? But our hypothesis was that if we were to pair these two, if we then gave monkeys a choice on day 4 between these two brands, and they get food no matter what, they choose one or the other, it's always exactly the same, that if they show a bias, that's an advertising-induced bias. Right? The value of the social information is bleeding over into, right? It's attaching itself to that brand. Okay, does that make sense? And that's basically what we found. I wouldn't show this to you. I would show it to you if it didn't come out this way. But for male monkeys, basically, they were more likely to choose the brands that had been advertised by sexy female monkeys, basically. A little bit less so for high-status monkeys, and basically no difference from 0 in terms of being sold by a low-status monkey. Okay, so this is showing that we are so wired to connect that advertisers have been capitalizing on this. This is a 25 million year old adaptation, as far as I can tell, given that it is shared by us and by rhesus macaques and probably every other anthropoid primate, right? We just intrinsically value the social information and we can capitalize on it because it's going to add value to whatever information, commodity, etc. is associated with it over time. Okay. Now I'm going to turn to I'm going to kind of use this as a springboard to begin talking about brands more generally. Okay, so if there's any questions up to the moment, maybe it's a good time to ask. Yeah.
Females, flat.
No, well, for female macaques, we did a whole exploration of what seems to be valuable for them. And female macaque, it turns out, if you look at a male macaque from behind, they display a lot of information about their status and their breeding condition based on the size and redness of their scrotum. And so female macaques are actually very, very interested in that and value that quite a lot. And so we actually saw this pattern exactly, we saw this exact same pattern in females when it was information about males. We did not go there in humans. Okay, we're sort of done with that.
So why the difference with the humans?
Well, I think Well, if I were to spin an evolutionary psychology story, which I'm not want to do necessarily, the conjecture would be that females value other things than sort of physical attractiveness, or like that's only one dimension. And we tried to test that a long time ago, and it was kind of a poorly done experiment, but it is kind of a fun story again. We were looking for, one of the things we thought is that it might make a difference whether the females were familiar with the individuals or not, right? So, and so we tried to identify an environment, an institution where there was varying degrees of, say, social status, that they either be familiar or unfamiliar. So this is kind of the Wild West days of doing this work. We used the neurobiology department at Duke as our stimulus set, where they were full professors, associates, assistant professors, postdocs, graduate students, and our participants that we tested were either within the department or outside the department, so they could either have knowledge of those those relationships or not. Now, obviously, there's sort of things like age that are very difficult for us to control for. But what we found when we did that, we kind of replicated our results with males, which is a familiar, unfamiliar. They paid a lot to see the faces of female graduate students on average. And that was about it. And females were, first of all, valued information on anybody who was familiar, okay, based on this metric. And kind of the scary part was that they were paying the most to see the images of the full professor males. Now, this is a really poorly, again, it's a poorly done experiment because we couldn't control for age. And we also, there are a lot of other things going on, which is that these are the guys who can ruin your career, ruin your life. There's a lot of reasons that could be behind this. So I think it's a very difficult, it gets really tricky looking at social status in people, although there have been a lot of advances made lately. Not so much based on what information you value about them, but this is a little bit off on a tangent here, but both one's own sense of your relative status or your socioeconomic status or how other people rate you in terms of status is a predictor of how much activity you have in your social brain network. So basically, high status people, whether it's socioeconomic, SES, or within their group, their social brain networks are turned down. So they're actually getting less information about other people, probably because they're paying less attention to them. Whereas people who are on the lower rungs of the ladder, theirs are turned all the way up. Which I think is lots of really interesting implications. Yeah, question?
Curious how you also consider other kinds of social impacts on these types of experiments. I'm thinking of like the experiment, how you can understand whether things like affective displays of whoever they're looking at is affecting the amount of time.
Yep.
Again, class elements, racialized elements, all of those kinds of things, how it is that you can account for that. In terms of how people, especially young men, are socialized in a setting of actually looking at images.
No question. That's why I didn't want to try to explain it. What I want to emphasize is that we have a metric, right, that allows us to at least go in to the brain and determine if you value something, right? If you value social information, then I'm going to find it in this network. I'm going to find it at the level of single neurons. Okay, and if it's valuable social information, that has the potential to be attached to other kinds of things through something like advertising, which all it really is association, right? It's just reinforcement. So all those other things are important. We tried to do everything we could to make sure all our photos were neutral, so-called neutral in expression, but that's certainly a feature that you'd want to be interested in because some kinds of social expressions, maybe facial expressions, could have more or less information value. And I think that's where you get at one place where this gets tricky, which is that value doesn't necessarily mean hedonic value. Right? Information about dominant individuals may not be hedonically pleasing, but it has high information content for your adaptive behavior. In fact, some data that's consistent with that, which is that although monkeys will pay to see faces of dominant males, they look away from them as soon as they see them. Whereas in general, things that are hedonically pleasing, you tend to look longer at. Like dwell time on the image is a good proxy for how pleasant, how pleasurable, how rewarding those things are. Is that more or less? I'm kind of waffling my way out of some of the thornier questions at their end, but they're all great. They're really important. We'll return to the ethnic part in a second. So I want to now turn to brands. And it's obvious to everybody here, especially in today's market economy, that companies spend a lot of money on brands to build relationships with customers. And brands were originally developed to signal ownership, like you were a person who owned this cow. Okay, please return the cow to me because it's mine. So they're easily recognizable markers of identity of an individual, right? And now we have this sense that brands actually are they signal a lot of things, but they're things that we would kind of consider to be social. So people describe brands in terms of as they having personalities, right, and identities. People use brands as a means of signaling their own identity. So it's sort of taken on all of these social, other social dimensions, right? Brands seem to have status, right? Apple seems to have high status, Samsung has a lower status. And it's just led to the hypothesis that essentially brands are like people, and that our brains relate to brands using the same mechanisms in our heads that evolved to support our relationships with people, to manage our connections with people. Until recently, until a study that we just did, there had not been any test of that, any direct test of that. And so what we did was to try to go beyond self-report and subjective assessments to get let's say objective assessment of how people are relating to brands. Okay, what mechanisms in their brains are they actually doing? And this allows us, by using neuroscience techniques, this allows us to go beyond self-report, and self-report can be biased, certainly inaccurate, it can be superficial, and it can be outright deceptive when people do not want to reveal what it is, how they actually feel or what they're actually thinking, because of they're being assessed. Right? Somebody's asking them these questions. And so to tell you about this study that we did, I'm going to step back and tell you about a study that a postdoc in my lab did when he was a graduate student at PKU in the marketing department. He's very interested in empathy and what are the factors that kind of shape empathy, okay, and how we relate to other people. And one of the studies, or a whole set of studies they did, involved people watching a couple of videos that of the sort that I'm going to show you now. And I just want you to watch the video and just kind of feel whatever you feel, think whatever you think. Okay, so here comes one. Okay, and here's another one. Okay. So, first of all, nobody was hurt making these videos. These are fake needles that are blunt and they push back up into the syringe, so it's kind of clever. Also, he did made versions of these videos where people were actually expressing, kind of pain. But this is using this very neutral expression as a way to disentangle the expression from the understanding of what that person might be experiencing. So what he did was to compare the verbal responses and brain empathy responses, and I'll get to that in a second, of people who are either Caucasian or ethnically Chinese. Okay, while watching these videos of either a Caucasian woman or an ethnically Chinese woman, face being apparently pierced with a needle. Everybody said, that looks painful, I feel pain. I feel pain for that person. Okay, basically universal endorsement. But you might suspect that there would be differences nevertheless, depending on whether that person was within your own ethnic group. Okay, we've seen that in the level of behavior, but what he found, I think, was very striking at the level of neurobiology. So what he did was to focus on, this is sort of a medial view, so take the sagittal cut down the middle of my head, pull this part of my head off, and you're looking in. This is a part of the brain here that you kind of think of as our empathy, one of the main sources of empathy. So this is an area that will light up pain for self, pain for somebody else. You get more activity if it's pain for a loved one, okay? And the level of activity predicts how much effort or money you will expend to help that individual. Okay, so it's a pretty robust part of the actual feeling of empathy. And what he found is that in Chinese observers, you get a big brain empathy response to seeing a Chinese woman's face being pierced with a needle, but very little response to seeing somebody who's Caucasian, and exactly the opposite. Caucasian observers, big brain empathy response to seeing a Caucasian woman's face being poked with a needle, but not so much for a Chinese woman. Okay, so this is very depressing. So no matter what you say in terms of empathy, it turns out, at least at the level, your brain is treating those two different brains. These people are treating those two different videos in very different ways, depending on kind of ethnic group membership. Yes.
Did you control whether or not they had seen what, just...
Yeah, order effects were, so yes, everything was kind of balanced in terms of order, and they repeated many times, different videos. So this is just an example of those two. So sure, you might expect that if you showed one first, then the second one you'd have less of an effect. So absolutely. And you can do this using brain imaging, you can do this using EEG or measuring brain waves. There's a whole bunch of different ways of measuring these responses. Okay, super depressing, right? Oh my God, we have built-in kind of, bias. And that probably is the case sort of in some ways in terms of the statistics of the group you grow up with, right? And I could talk to you more about that. There's animal work that's much better on that. The human work is not at that level yet. But if you grow up in a relatively homogeneous environment, then your brain is going to treat people who kind of look like all the people you grew up with as more of your in-group than people who don't look like that. But there are, I think if you just sort of step back from it, we all have had experiences where people from all walks of life, different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic statuses, different places, come together and they behave as if they're one. Okay, so you go to an Eagles game or whatever, a bunch of people from all over Philadelphia, New Jersey, etc. They put on green jerseys, and now they're ready to fight with people with blue jerseys on. I mean, so that's kind of weird, right? It happens sort of instantaneously. The only thing that unites all these folks is that they're wearing green jerseys. They root for the same team, and this actually, is a sort of real-world example of minimal group effects in psychology, where you can bring college students into the lab, and you can say, you're on the blue team, you're on the red team, and you guys are going to have to, you're going to have some competition later, and suddenly all the blue team people are like, oh, I really hate the red team, and you start developing these very strong group biases, and also real strong attachment to the people who are in your group. And so Fung went back and replicated this experiment, but now he had the women in the videos either wearing a red t-shirt or a blue t-shirt, and then you would assign your participant to wear a red t-shirt or blue t-shirt, and say you're going to be, you're on the red team or you're on the blue team, you're going to have to do something about that later. So what he found was that the brain empathy response, this sort of other ethnic group effect, you still observe it for individuals who are on the other team. Okay? But if you're on the same team, now that brain empathy response is rescued. Okay, so being on the same team overrides the apparent ethnic difference. So if you're emphasizing the features that along which the dimensions along which you share with each other, right? That if you put that as top of the mind, that changes the way the brain actually treats that other individual. Your brain shows an empathy response. So that inspired us in our study, which is a study about how customers think and feel about their smartphone brand. Okay, and so we recruited to the lab, and basically the two dominant players in that market in the US are Apple and Samsung. So we recruited obligate Apple and obligate Samsung device users to the lab, which is a little bit challenging to find, especially Samsung users who didn't have an Apple product somewhere. And they came into the lab, and this is a brain imaging experiment, so lying in an MRI machine over in the hospital, and they're basically, over time, they're seeing statements saying something good or bad happens to either Apple or Samsung, either to their own brand or the other brand. They rate how they feel about that, and then after the experiment, they're going to also indicate the likelihood that they would share that information on social media. And we're going to test this idea that customers develop strong empathy for their own brand. Okay, so that's the idea behind this experiment. There's a whole wide array of different kinds of events that could happen. You know, Steve Jobs dies, or Samsung battery explodes on a plane, things like that. And when you ask people how they feel, they report empathy for their brand. So in Apple customers, they see something positive about Apple, I feel really good. Negative, I feel really bad, and somewhat in between. For neutral events, I feel less empathy toward Samsung, right? But unless, you know, it's not my brand, I don't care so much about it. Samsung customers, they feel really good for good news about Samsung, really bad about bad news. Oh, and they also feel a little schaden for Apple. So when something bad happens to Apple, they feel a little bit good. And when something good happens to Apple, they report feeling a little bit bad. And that's going to be important when we look at the brain imaging data. And so our hypothesis was that if you develop a strong emotional bond, social connection with your smartphone brand, that when something good happens to Apple, and you're an Apple user, you'll get activity in this reward network, okay, sort of for positive value. And if something bad happens, you see bad news, you're going to have activation in this network of brain areas that is involved in empathy for pain, okay, which is what we saw before. So now I'm going to show you the data, which I think is pretty interesting. I'll walk you through it. So these are Apple customers, Samsung customers, Apple News, Samsung News, Apple News, Samsung News, and we'll go from positive and negative. And so, as predicted, in Apple customers, they see good news about Apple, they get activity in the reward network. They see bad news about Apple, they get pain network activity, so sort of pain empathy. And nothing when they hear news about Samsung, reads news about Samsung. What about Samsung customers? Okay, Samsung News, this is not so good if you're CMO for Samsung, Chief Marketing Officer. Positive news about Samsung. Nothing in the reward network. Negative news about Samsung. Nothing in the pain network. So Samsung is having absolutely no social emotional connection with their customers at all. The only thing that's going on is that Samsung customers are having a pain response when they read good news about Apple, and a reward response when they read bad news about Apple, something bad happened to Apple, which is really, I think, very interesting, is discordant from what they reported in terms of their subjective feelings. Okay, so there's a disconnect between what their brain is telling us and what their mouth is telling us, which I think is very interesting, and we'll talk about what that might reflect. If we just don't worry too much about what all this means in terms of contrast, but if we look at Apple customers, basically hearing news about Apple, seeing news about Apple relative to news on Samsung activates this other network. So this is independent of valence. This other network that is what is often known as a self-referential network. This is a network that's involved anytime you're thinking about yourself in the future, or individuals who are close associates of yours, friends and family. This is your tribe. Okay? But when you look at Samsung, you don't see any of that. You just see a bit of activity in this other network that is devoted to processing information on distant others. Okay? People you don't like, you don't have a connection with, right? Not part of your tribe. So Apple has created this incredibly great sense of belonging, of community. It's as if it's your family, right? Apple. And Samsung has done quite the opposite. They haven't really invested in that. Now I want to tell you a little bit about what we found from social media sharing. Apple and Samsung customers share different kinds of information. So basically, Apple is sharing anything that's interesting, Apple customers. Okay, so it's just like engagement. Anything different from average, from neutral. For both Apple and Samsung, stronger for Samsung. Samsung customers are selectively sharing positive news about Samsung and negative news about Apple. Okay, that's what they're motivated by, and those are the kinds of things that are really driving reward in them. And this, as I kind of mentioned before, we looked at a couple of different models, 3 different models, and this is a information criteria, so the lower is better. The engagement model accounts for the reports, the self-reports of the behavioral ratings, of the Apple users. So anything that was interesting about Apple, they would share. Whereas for Samsung users, it was more about anything that really felt good. And the things that feel good are good news about Samsung and really bad news about Apple. Okay? And again, what we found is that activity in this self-directed network predicted sharing of information as well, okay, for Apple users and not for Samsung users. For Samsung users, it was the reward network. So this sort of self-referential network, we know from the work of Emily Falk and Annenberg here, that people who are kind of engaging in more theory of mind, thinking about the mental states of others, when they hear information, they read information in the New York Times or whatever, that the more activity you get here, the more likely they are to share, and the more likely they are actually to be followed, because they are people who convey more useful information to other people. So again, we're seeing Apple and Samsung customers differentiate along those dimensions. And really, if you want to know what the punchline is here, it's all about Apple for both groups of customers. So Apple customers, Apple is their tribe, it's their community, right? Apple's done a great job of making them feel like they're part of this, this group. Whereas Samsung customers, they define themselves as not being Apple. Okay? Everything that we see in their brains tells us that the reason why they're choosing Samsung, except for possibly the fact that it's a low-cost, well-functioning machine, well-functioning device, but the only emotional connections they have are, I just don't want to be Apple. There's a lot of interesting kind of business applications of this. I mean, Samsung is spending a heck of a lot more money on advertising, and yet, Apple's mobile business is much stronger, at least it has been until recently. So Samsung is potentially losing customers, and we would certainly predict that of the customers that we brought into the lab, those who showed the lowest activity within the self-network would be the ones who were more likely to switch to another brand. And if I were a third brand coming in to the US market, I would be aiming at the Samsung customers and not at the Apple customers, because you're not going to get somebody to leave their tribe. Okay? They're going to stick with their tribe. So with that, I'm about up at kind of the end of my time here, but I just want to put in a plug for this initiative that I'm leading. It's called the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. That really stands for sort of Business Neuroscience Initiative. So this is a project that is open to and engages everybody in the community at Penn and larger, right? But it's a way of kind of taking, it's a venue, it's a mechanism for taking ideas, expertise, etc., from a variety of different domains and putting it into practice in business to help address lots of really interesting questions. Kind of the ones that are really of greatest interest and potential impact for me are the ones that attend management and human resources, in which potentially our greater understanding of the biology of social connection can potentially be used to help make workplaces a nicer place to work. You can put together better groups of people with a better running culture, so that hopefully businesses will be simultaneously more efficient but also more humane. Which I think if you think about the sources of stress in many people's lives, a big source of stress is workplace stress, bad bosses, bad teammates, and if we could do something about that, we could make people healthier and happier at work. So I'll just leave those up there. I don't need to read those for you, and just take questions if you have any. I know it's 3 after 1, so if you have to leave, feel free. Any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. So I don't know how you would begin to answer this question, or if it's even a question for value to you. But it kind of builds on, I think, what was asking earlier about racial and gender differences and decision-making processes. And I wanted to know something more about what you think the role of history is, in terms of, well, of course, we don't make decisions in a vacuum. It's not the first time we've ever made a decision, so there's a history of decision-making. but also in terms of the kinds of social standings people have vis-a-vis longer histories, just even within the United States, for example, in which some populations have been much more marginalized than others. And so in what, it seems, with that said, it seems hard for me to imagine a universal empathy sort of meter. So in what ways can the kinds of models that you're developing account for those sorts of...
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say that, unfortunately, at the moment, most neuroscience in humans is the sort of study population are college students, right? Which is a particular demographic in a variety of ways. And so we know very little about kind of cross-cultural, reactions, brain responses, et cetera, unfortunately, in relation to that. So that's something that has to be changed. A big part of that reflects the fact that most of this work is funded by NIH, which has a sort of human mental health, and not that the other questions you raised aren't important for that, but in terms of just kind of sketching out the basics of the architecture and how that varies in people in ways that are associated with different kind of neuropsychiatric or other conditions has been the foremost topic. Now, I think what you were bringing up is really, really important, and important even for the business applications that we are examining. So some of the stuff that we're looking at is related to kind of synchrony, chemistry, kind of this harmonic resonance of physiology across people, which seems to be higher in people who have greater trust in each other, work better together as a team. But we're trying to understand how cognitive and demographic diversity contribute to that kind of equation, and whether there are different settings where that might you could potentially use this information to help select better teams, better working groups for different kinds of tasks, and that's something that's ongoing. I said that I would speak to the sort of other group question with some animal work, and there was a really nice animated piece in the New York Times a month or two ago about, almost none of this work has been done in humans, but this is work done in rats. So rats show something like empathy or compassion for other rats. They will work to release a rat from discomfort. So if they're stuck in a tube or they're swimming and they need a platform, so they'll work to do that. What's interesting is that over the last 10 years, researchers have varied the kind of, for lack of a better word, demographic diversity of the groups that the rat grows up in, and looked at the impact on helping behavior. Okay, so if you raise a white rat, this one strain of rats, in an all-white rat group, they'll help other white rats, but they won't help black-colored rats, brown-colored rats, etc. If you raise a white rat in a group of black or brown-colored rats, they'll selectively help other individuals who look like the individuals they grew up with, but not white rats. And you can play with that in a variety of ways. So if they grew up in a very mixed demographic, so-called, then they will be more apt to help any other rat who's in trouble. So even in rats, right, there's a sensitivity during, that develops, right, over the lifespan that varies as a function of the kinds of individuals you see and interact with on a daily basis, right? And I think something similar must be going on with people, and that's just the first step,
Very
right?
presentist though, right? Because rats don't have a history.
Oh, no, exactly.
Generations of sedimentation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that question could maybe be very interesting to think about ways we could address that. I'm not the best suited to know from kind of the history and that side of things, but that's why we end up. That's why we have to work together.
I'm curious, and I know very little about neuroscience, so. So on the slide you had about the Chinese and
Caucasian.
Yeah.
I know those were just probably two different brain scans, but the actual images look different, and there was like the SMA and ACC particular in one, and they were separate on the
It was
other.
just identifying, those areas are, depending on where you set your threshold, sometimes you just get a big blob across the sort of separate.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question though gets at, and this is sort of on Deb's point, sometimes it feels like there's a bit of hardwiring in terms of, comparing to 25 years ago, which
Yeah.
are prime notes. But, how much or how do you control or how do you examine sort of neuroplasticity, right? And so the difference in empathy between sort of Chinese and Caucasian is it possible that it's more of a difference between how people in China are socialized to feel empathy versus North Americans? And again, I know that
It's quite
some
possible. What we're
populations are-
seeing is the difference in response to same versus different group. Yeah, plasticity is a huge part of brain function. The remarkable thing is that you find these areas, these circuits, in everybody, in more or less the same places, wired up in more or less the same way, and you can even identify these in childhood, right? So as early as you can begin brain scans on kids about 4 years old. So, and you can see these things are in place. Now that said, even the monkey study where you put monkeys in different sized groups shows that there's tremendous plasticity in that system, right? Depending on how you deploy it, you can overemphasize some, or not over, but you can emphasize the development of some functions and some skills that's typically at the expense of others. What's interesting, is our understanding of that plasticity was, 20 years ago, it was all about sensation. It was, if I spend a lot of time practicing violin, the sort of parts of the brain that are involved in the violin, elaborated. But now we know that that is true for social functions, mathematical function, math, reading, you name it. So it's absolutely going to be the case that how you're socialized, the culture you grew up in, the experiences you have are going to shape the way these things work. So this is just on a population. Hopefully that's your question. Maybe not deep enough.
And I think it's just a question of sort of, and like you said, expanding the study groups beyond.
Well, that's an absolute necessity. So I think for a lot of the questions that will be of interest to people here, that's the big gap that we just don't have right now, unfortunately. But you had a question, then, or we can go back here first. Okay, somebody else back there. Yeah.
So my question, I guess I'm interested in sort of the circuit between like publics that take up this kind of research and the work coming out of not just your lab, but this kind of like sort of popular science and popular takes on neuroscience. And I think often the way that these kinds of studies get taken up in at least like by various publics is that they sort of serve to naturalize assumptions about social behavior, right? So like, well, men are just hardwired in this way, and so I'm wondering how you, as a sort of rigorous producer of scientific knowledge in this world, think about that kind of public reception of your work and how you.
Yeah, I think that's really hard. It's very, I think, well, first of all, I think it's really important for us to communicate with the wider public and anybody who will listen. So I think that's an important part of my job as a scientist is to communicate. But the hard part is making the science simultaneously making it accessible and true to the science, right? And rigorous. And so that is where things I think can be quite challenging. And I think our sense of, or sort of trying to keep that aligned with or mindful of current conversations is something that's always a moving target too. Does that make sense? So it is challenging. And when I speak to a lot of different kinds of groups too. So whether it's press or business all the time. And what they want is, well, just give me the 3 steps to implement when I get home. How do I turn what I was talking about Does that mean I should, when I go back to my office, make everybody do this thing? Well, no, not necessarily. Let's step back a minute. Think about that. But it's kind of hard. You want to be rigorous, but you want to actually engage people and have them thinking about this. Is it at all rigorous? Okay, good. Good, thanks. Another question?
Yeah, I'm trying to put together the first part and the second part, and I realize you were showing us different areas of your research, and they
right.
don't necessarily, there isn't necessarily a strong connection between them. But in the first part, you were talking, for example, about women not being persuaded by images of alpha males or high-rated males. And then the second part, you're talking about this amazing Apple loyalty.
Yeah.
So I
Right.
guess a simple question is, in this later study, is it a co-ed study? Has gender fallen out of the picture here in the second? And the other question is, if the finding is that Apple have done this really good job of building this sense of identity that's more like community or communitas or collective effervescence or any of these
Right.
terms you're pulling from ritual studies, then is anyone on your team looking at and doing textual analysis of Apple ads versus Samsung ads? If they've built that loyalty, how?
That's the number one question. I think that we are starting to do that. So I think doing NLP textual analysis is one. There's all the other things they do with when you walk into the Apple store, everybody's wearing the same get up and gear. So I think there's a lot of components to how they've built that, and it's taken 20 years to get there. In that study, we were not powered well enough to look at gender. And that's so it's not really a question we can address. I don't know whether there are, that's another whole set of questions, I think.
Because from the minute, throughout the talk, I kept coming back to this question of brand loyalty by gender. Like,
Yeah.
women buy a lot of
Sure.
consumer items by brand.
Sure.
Women are, I know that men are still buying a lot of big ticket items. They make a lot of decisions in households around things like cars.
Yes.
But for smaller ticket items, women are the drivers of a lot of this brand loyalty you're talking about. So
Yes.
where does that enter into these kinds of considerations?
That's a great question. There have been as far as I know, three neuroscience studies of branding. Or two prior to ours, and then we've got a few in the pipeline. So there's not a lot out there. So there was a couple of interesting studies on kind of brand personality with words you use to describe particular brands, and kind of the mapping of that across people, right? And we've done a similar set of studies. It's not excuse me. It's not based on personality, but based on recall. So brand equity. So basically, if you ask people, just list car brands in order that you remember them, and that more or less correlates very well with market share. Okay, that could be for a variety of reasons. You do it for beer, you do it for soft drinks. Well, we did a study where we did that. We asked people to recall different car brands, and then we scanned their participants' brains while they saw different car brands, right? And we looked at how much of a match there was between the category car and the brands. And basically what you find is that the higher that match in terms of just patterns of activity across the brain predicts recall, predicts market share, and then you can go and do, I'm talking about something totally different now, but I just can't help tell you. But then we went on to look at the correspondence to a different category completely, which was computer. And what you find is that the alignment of responses to car brands, right, predicts how good people see the fit of that brand making a computer, basically. So in terms of brand generalization. And to kind of the final part of that story is that now, instead of looking at that relationship with an individual, we look at it across people. So it's kind of like a measure of collective thinking, if you will. The higher the overlap across people, right, the better the prediction of sales market share and things like that. So we're starting to inch towards some of these questions about, where we can begin to look at segmentation. We can look at segmentation along gender lines, along other kinds of demographic lines. I think that's where it's going to get really interesting. But we need, the problem is you have to have a lot more power. You have to have a lot more subjects. And brain imaging studies are really expensive. $1,000 an hour to put somebody in an MRI machine, and then you've got to pay somebody to analyze that data too. So it's not cheap. Yeah.
My question is about individual variability. So
Yeah.
did you find more or less variability in this? The study about linking images to reward choose and moving for money. Was there more variability in those responses to monkeys and to humans, and how much variability was that between what you were finding between men and women?
Oh, in that study. Oftentimes.
Like I would expect monkeys to be less variable.
Uh,
than I'm sure.
We have examined, monkeys are, they're literally a captive population for us. So we can run all kinds of different variations on experiments. So we looked at the factors that shape that value function. And there is variability across monkeys, so status itself is a driver. In a way that maybe is similar to what we see in humans, and the novelty of that information. So if we're continuing to see the same kind of pictures, same information, it becomes less rewarding as well. So there's a lot of, none of it. When I say we're wired to connect, what I mean is that we have the wiring in there, and most of us have the spontaneously have the interest in acquiring it. Right? But it doesn't mean that necessarily the specific content of that information is right, if that makes sense.
I spent the first part of my career in the advertising business. And then I came back and I'm an anthropologist, archaeologist now. But I have a question about your second point up there. We're hardwired to connect with others, and this drives hurting and susceptibility to social advertising. Does that mean that traditional media like television and radio and newspaper, which are pretty much lonely pursuits, or maybe with your family, are less influential these days than social media, than blog posts or Facebook, or where people can talk to each other across?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, on one hand, you might expect that in the days when we were growing up, there was only there were only a few channels of information, right? And you couldn't pursue them simultaneously. It was very difficult. So that allows a lot of access to this machinery. So you might predict even that I don't know. I mean, you could have a hypothesis that these effects might have been bigger then than now. On the other hand, like you say, because there's so much opportunity for communication, conversation, sharing, that it in fact is potentially amplified now. And that's something I've heard from companies that initially kind of stimulated our interest in pursuing this. It's very challenging to keep up, and if your company is not good at capitalizing on social media and influencers, then you're going to fall behind. So that's a waffling out. I don't know what the answer is, but I could see it kind of shaking out either way, potentially.
Just a quick follow-up, if you wanted to change your brand from A to B, it's probably social media is perhaps a better
Absolutely.
way to do it than
Yeah. Well, it's certainly lower cost.
lower cost.
friction. Absolutely.
Thank you for I'm wondering about the connection between brands and other forms of social identity or groups that people might feel something along.
Yeah.
And in particular, if there's anything in this research that sort of teases apart the relationship between being identified with a brand, like Apple, and feeling a sense of identity, connection, belonging, and actually feeling an investment or a sense of identity around a different other kind of social grouping, be it gender, race, ethnicity, whatever, that's associated with that.
Yeah.
class that as there's all kinds of.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and in this study, there's actually there's a big status differential between Apple and Samsung in terms of how they are perceived by both the customers and and other people as well. So we think that's playing into this. We are right now running this an analogous study on political parties, political affiliation. So that was it's just not done, but basically looking at Democrats and Republicans and looking at whether we see empathy for empathy, a strong emotional connection to the party and to other people who are, that's sort of the next extension. This is to people who are part of that community as well. So this is my brain empathy response, like in those videos, vary as a function of knowing that and actually literally we have people wearing, proud Republican or proud Democrat t-shirts or hats, etc. And so, stay tuned. Hopefully before the next election we'll have results worth talking about. That was sort of the first natural place for us to go with that.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.